Good evening. My name is Susie Prush, and I am the manager of university events and responsible for putting on, or at least arranging to find a wonderful speaker for the Constitution Day lecture. Before we get started, I'd like to ask all of you to turn off your cell phones. Thank you for attending Gonzaga University's 5th annual celebration of Constitution Day, and mandated all colleges and universities that receive federal funds to hold an educational program about the U.S. Constitution on or about September 17th of every year. These requirements were added to the bill by Senator Byrd, a Democrat from West Virginia. Our lecture this evening is titled Henry Louis Gates, Jr. and Beyond, American Policing and the Problem of Institutional Racism. We seem to have lots of opportunities here for discussion about Dr. Gates and the Cambridge Police with regard to both the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment of our Bill of Rights. However, I hear tell that our speaker tonight will focus on an issue that pertains to procedural due process in our 14th Amendment, in particular the Equal Protection Clause, which requires states to provide equal protection under the law to all people within their jurisdictions. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer. Vikas Gumbur is an assistant professor in our Sociology and Criminal Justice Department. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Regis University and both his MS and his PhD degrees from the University of Oregon, majoring in sociology in all three of his degrees. Dr. Gumbur teaches courses in the Introduction to Criminal Justice and the Sociology of Policing, as well as the sociological history of rock and roll. I think he's very proud of that last one. His areas of research include policing and inequality in the criminal justice program or system. Vic is an avid collector of rock and roll posters, and he has an outstanding collection of Star Wars memorabilia, which he creates from thousands and thousands of Lego pieces. At the conclusion of his talk, there will be a question and answer session, and now please welcome Dr. Gumbur.
Right off the bat, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy schedules to attend this lecture. It's great to see all of the faces here today. I will go ahead and apologize to the people far off to the sides. I'm generally rather bad about redirecting my attention throughout any lecture that I give, especially in a broad room. Please don't take it personally. Finally, I would apologize for the fact that much of today's lecture is going to come directly from the script you see in front of you. This is because I am dealing with an incredibly sensitive issue. And as such, I want to be sure that I choose my words very carefully. For any people who are interested in the content of this lecture, I will gladly send you a transcript of the script I have in front of me. Who knows, maybe I'll go a little bit off script. To begin with, 6 minutes. On July 16, 2009, the Cambridge, Massachusetts Police Department received a 911 call reporting a potential breaking and entering. At 12:45 p.m., radio dispatch sent a call out to officers, and Sergeant James M. Crowley responded. At 12:51 p.m., the legal resident of the home, esteemed Harvard professor Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr., was placed under arrest. Not for burglary, not for breaking and entering, but rather for disorderly conduct. 6 minutes. 6 minutes is all it took for a celebrated black scholar to be led away from his residence in handcuffs, to become part of a dubious yet far from exclusive club, African American males entwined in the American criminal justice system. So what exactly happened over those 6 minutes? While the accounts of Sergeant Crowley and Dr. Gates differ on some details, there is consensus on several important points. It is clear that Dr. Gates provided Sergeant Crowley with his identification, and this established that he was the legal resident of the house. It is clear that there was no crime, no breaking and entering, no burglary. It is clear that Dr. Gates was angered by the officer's presence and questions. He was not deferential to the officer. In fact, it is fair to say that Dr. Gates challenged the legitimacy of Sergeant Crowley's chosen tactics, suggesting loudly and in no uncertain terms that the officer was treating him differently because of his race. It is clear that Sergeant Crowley maintained a professional demeanor throughout the encounter, though it is unclear if the officer provided his name and badge number to Dr. Gates when Dr. Gates requested it. And it is clear that the arrest occurred after all of this had already happened. Those 6 minutes and the 4+ hours that followed at the Cambridge police station resulted in an intense and predictably polarized public reaction. Dr. Jelani Cobb, a professor of history at Spelman College, summarized the emotional impact of Dr. Gates' arrest. When one of the most recognizable African Americans in the country can be arrested in his own home and have to justify being in his own home, it's really kind of unfathomable. If it can happen to him, it can happen to any of us. Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, professor of sociology at Georgetown, provided additional context to those 6 minutes. It is striking that Gates seems to be the victim of a police mentality that chafes at a challenge to its implicit authority. While it may be true for folk of all races, it seems especially galling to cops to be questioned by a person of color. How dare black folk believe that regardless of their station or privilege, they have the permission to speak back to state-enforced authority, one that, not a decade ago, routinely ravaged black communities in blatant displays of wanton aggression. Others came to the defense of Sergeant Crowley. Dr. Maria Haberfeld, a professor of political science at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, provided insight into how officers understand such encounters. A call to respond to a burglary in progress generates a series of images that prepare a police officer for an encounter, a dangerous encounter that can possibly end with a loss of life. The professor may have raised his voice, and this would appear now as justifiable under the circumstances. But when somebody challenges the authority or the domain of a police officer who is just called to restore order, the discretionary process of the officer is not the same as that of a bystander. The professor seemingly lost his temper. One might say that is fine given the circumstances. The police officer did not lose his temper. He just made a decision that, one might say, could have been justified by the totality of the circumstances. President Barack Obama weighed in on this controversy, initially calling the actions of the Cambridge Police Department stupid. He seemingly backtracked 2 days later, saying that he could have calibrated his words more carefully. However, President Obama stood by his contention that there was an overreaction in pulling Professor Gates out of his home. Though he added, Professor Gates probably overreacted as well. Roughly a week later, the Cambridge Police Department asked the prosecutor to drop all charges against Dr. Gates. But this, however, was not the end of it. On July 31st, Sergeant Crowley, Dr. Gates, President Obama, and Vice President Joe Biden met at the White House to discuss the incident in what has been dubiously dubbed the Beer Summit. And with this meeting, the events of those 6 minutes on July 16th were, and with this meeting, the events of those 6 minutes on July 16th were neatly and tidily addressed. Diplomacy had been established. With all the directly affected parties talking, there was no longer any need for the public to concern themselves with this matter. And America moved on. What has troubled me most about the public discourse on these events has been the obsessive attention paid to those 6 minutes. Critics have scoured the details, hoping to find a smoking gun that would allow them to place blame clearly and definitely on the shoulders of one or the other actor. When exactly did Dr. Gates provide Sergeant Crowley with his identification? How many times did Dr. Gates have to ask for Sergeant Crowley's name and badge number before the officer provided it? And exactly how loud and tumultuous was Dr. Gates' conduct? And how exactly did it end up happening in a public space? Such scouring has not been limited to the 6 minutes in question. It has extended well into the personal and professional lives of each man. Many questioned the potential threat that Dr. Gates may have posed, considering that he has such a slight build and he frequently walks with a cane. Others defended Sergeant Crowley against charges of racism, noting that he is responsible for the department's efforts to address racially biased policing. In the process of focusing all of our attention on the individuals and the drama of those 6 minutes, the larger context has largely been lost. As such, my challenge to you is to look beyond the exigencies of those 6 minutes. Look beyond the characteristics of the actors involved. Look beyond the media sensationalism, which was truly out of control in this case, and ask yourself one really important question. How did we get here? How did we get to a point where a decorated and respected officer would arrest a man for disorderly conduct in essentially what is that very man's own home? How did we get to a point where one of our nation's most celebrated scholars, black or otherwise, would react with such anger and resentment to what many would consider to be the minimally intrusive and rather reasonable requests of a police officer? The answers to these questions involve a deeper and more critical examination of our country's current culture of justice. This examination must delve into the context of contemporary policing, as well as the current structure of the institution, its politics, its priorities, its place within the larger machine. We must start with a snapshot of the current system. A recent report from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency on the state of the American criminal justice system confirmed what I imagine most scholars and many Americans already know. Racial inequalities continue to permeate the system. Consider several findings from the report. People of color are more likely to be the target of police action and intervention. Arrest rates for African Americans are 2.5 times higher than the arrest rates for whites. In terms of drug offenses, African Americans are arrested at a rate 3.5 times higher than that of whites. People of color are more likely to be the subjects of some form of oversight by the criminal justice systems. In terms of the total control rate, which refers to the total number of people who are being monitored in some way, shape, or form by the criminal justice system, the rate for African Americans is 4 times that for whites. People of color are substantially overrepresented in America's prison system. African Americans are incarcerated at over 6 times the rate of whites. African Americans are more likely to be sentenced to prison than whites, even when accounting for the type and seriousness of the crime. Finally, the distribution of capital punishment differs across racial and ethnic lines. While African Americans comprise 13% of the United States population, this group accounts for 42% of those sentenced to death. To be clear, the findings of the National Council on Crime and Delinquency's report are nothing new to scholars. While studies may diverge as to the magnitude of the disparities, there is a consensus that people of color in general, and African Americans and Latinos specifically, are subjected to harsher, more severe, and more punitive treatment within the American system of criminal justice. Whenever I consider the extent and impact of the racial inequalities in the American system of criminal justice, I find myself troubled by 2 interrelated questions. First, why isn't there more outrage at this situation? Given the magnitude of the disparities, as well as the fact that things have gotten unarguably worse over the last 25 years, I am puzzled by the frightful lack of action on the part of the American public. Where are the protests? Where are the marches? Why isn't middle-class America as outraged over these conditions as they were over those 6 minutes in Cambridge? Second, I wonder what these numbers mean to the police, or how they rationalize and justify the fact that their work, frequently puts them at odds with communities of color, as well as how their work is a vital part of the reproduction of these inequalities. Over the past 9 years, my research agenda has focused almost exclusively on racial profiling. In the process of conducting my research and presenting my findings at conferences, I have met and talked with numerous officers from all ranks and backgrounds. I have consistently been impressed with their dedication and their professionalism. I believe that most, if not all, of these officers chose their profession out of a desire to make a positive contribution to the community. I reject the contention that this is just a front, that the police project this image to hide some insidiously explicit racial agenda. I believe that these officers have a genuine interest in seeking and achieving justice. Thus, the question troubles me with regards to the police is how they maintain their belief that they are pursuing justice in such strong evidence to the contrary. I believe that the central challenge to making sense of both the systemic inequalities and the 6 minutes in Cambridge is our antiquated understanding of racism. In other words, it's our outdated and outmoded understanding of prejudice, of discrimination, and of racism in general that cripple our efforts to both understand and meaningfully transform social relations. For example, in the United States, many people still equate racism with the deep-seated illogical hatred, a passionate animosity directed at a racial or ethnic group, a zealous antipathy grounded in emotion and unassailable by reason. This conceptualization is shrouded in the imagery of lynchings, the Ku Klux Klan, and more recently, neo-Nazi skinheads. These beliefs and images blind Americans to the more complex machinations that produce, rationalize, and justify inequalities in and beyond the criminal justice system. So as long as our system and those within it do not look like the racists of days gone by, so long as they can effectively distance themselves from the irrationality associated with these conceptions of racism, so long as they can point to a reason, a justification, a rationale other than race to explain their actions, then many Americans would be reticent to consider, much less apply, the label of racism. The solution lies in replacing our outmoded and outdated understanding of racism with a conceptualization that recognizes the complexity of contemporary social life. From my standpoint, the solution is to examine these phenomena from an institutional perspective, or to understand these phenomena as manifestations of institutional racism. In simple terms, this perspective attempts to grasp how the machinations of social institutions generate and sustain racial and ethnic inequalities. In the past, institutional racism has been explicit. Consider the Jim Crow era, where the law mandated differential treatment of whites and non-whites, which is a really far too polite way of saying the law served to maintain and perpetuate both the privileged position of whites and the subordinate position of others. Today, institutional racism, with very few exceptions, lacks this overtly racial component. Rather than explicitly directing or sanctioning disparate treatment, contemporary institutions reproduce and exacerbate existing inequalities through seemingly race-neutral practices. More importantly, these institutions provide society with the myths and justifications that are used to rationalize disparate treatment. Of particular interest here is the idea of rationalization. It's not simply that the system creates inequalities, but also that it provides explanations that individuals, social groups, and other institutions can use to justify disparate treatment, or at the very least to deflect accusations of racism. These rationales are of the utmost importance when it comes to understanding the relationship between institutional racism and disparities in the administration of justice in general and the conflict between minority communities and the police specifically. And I hope to illustrate why here momentarily. Institutional racism, more importantly, rejects the idea that discriminatory practices are necessarily tied to the beliefs and independent actions of individuals. it is not that individual officers have ill will or negative beliefs about people of color and subsequently use their authority to act out these feelings through the harassment of minority citizens. No, these prejudices, if that word even applies, are cultivated by the institution of policing. That is, institutional choices, programs, policies, directives, beliefs, and values that exist independent of the individuals involved profoundly shape the officer's view and understanding of the world. Police training, both formal and informal, provides officers not only with the skills they need to do the job, but also with the ways in which they should understand the world. In this sense, the institution of policing can be understood like a lens through which officers view the world. And like any lens, it bends and distorts the image, bringing some things into much clearer focus, while leaving others blurry and unrecognizable. If we are to understand these phenomena, from the 6 minutes in Cambridge to the disparities that pervade our system, we must employ an analysis of the mandates, the priorities, the programs, the concerns, and the values of these institutions. Over the past 30 years, a number of developments, political, economic, legal, sociological, and technological, have transformed the institution of policing. 3 of these developments are of particular importance to our current discussion. At first glance, these may appear to be little more than understandable policies and adaptations to a mounting crime problem. However, if you dig a little bit deeper and explore the ramifications, especially how these policies interact with one another, you can begin to see how these institutional features have not only aggravated existing inequalities, but also exacerbated the systemic disparities discussed earlier. The first of these developments, declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, the war took on its contemporary flavor, if you will, during the Reagan administration of the 1980s. Like Nixon, Reagan used drugs as a scapegoat for urban decay and the persistence of racial and class-based inequality. The problem wasn't that economic opportunities were disappearing, nor was it that our crumbling infrastructure, both physical and ideological, could no longer sustain the mythology of the American dream. No. Drugs were the cause. Drugs were public enemy number 1. And through the imagery and symbolism of war, a symptom of large-scale social decay was unequivocally criminalized. A line was drawn, and sides were chosen. You were either with us, the fine, upstanding members of polite society, or you were with them, the criminal rabble. While this choice seemed easy for white, middle-class America, families in less privileged positions often found themselves divided on some front. Beyond this, there are several characteristics of the war on drugs that have had a profound impact on the work of the police and their relationship with minority communities. First, the war on drugs can best be understood as a supply-side war, with the majority of funds going to programs that are designed to, and this is the government's own words, disrupt the marketplace. The idea was, and really still is, that if we ratchet up the penalties high enough for drug use and drug distribution, then people will make the rational choice not to engage in this behavior. As reasonable as this may sound to many of us, this simplistic logic demonstrates a profound ignorance as to the physiological and psychological dimensions of addiction, not to mention the preponderance of sociological research on such drug organizations and the dynamics of deterrence. The result is this. The police have found themselves, over the past 30 years, fighting a war they cannot win and a war with no end in sight. Second, the war on drugs has had a very specific geographic focus. Insofar as the war on drugs has always been a war first and foremost on illicit drugs, the attention of the police has always been squarely focused on areas where these drugs are readily and publicly available. Not surprising, this has led authorities to concentrate their efforts on areas where the crumbling opportunity structure has made the drug trade a viable option for residents. Simply put, this has led the police to converge on America's deteriorating urban centers. Considering that these areas are disproportionately populated by minority groups, this seemingly rational choice to go where the drugs are has made people of color the target of these campaigns. To further embrace the metaphor of war, communities of color have become occupied territory, and their residents have become potential enemy combatants. Finally, it is important to consider the role that the crack epidemic has played on the development of the war on drugs. This highly addictive drug that was explicitly linked to increasingly violent gang activity became the ultimate and unquestionable rationale for the police focus on the inner cities. The dual scourge of crack cocaine and gang activity justified not only increased police surveillance of these areas, but also the integration of military training, tactics, and technology, which we will discuss more in a moment. The federal government reinforced and legitimized police action by ramping up the sanctions for crack cocaine in the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988. The 1986 legislation substantially increased the penalty for possession of 50 grams of crack cocaine, allowing judges to sentence convicts to up to 10 years in prison. Interestingly, this was not accompanied by an increase in the sentencing framework for powder cocaine, creating a huge disparity. The ratio was 100 to 1. To put it in other words, to be sentenced to 10 years for powder cocaine, you had to be caught in possession of 5,000 grams, compared to 50 grams of crack. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 specified that a mere 5 grams of crack cocaine constituted possession with intent to distribute, again exposing defendants to much more severe sentences for crack possession than for any other drug on the books. Such legislation clearly communicated to the police that crack was the priority, and the police responded by arresting young black and Latino males in droves. What is important to note here is that any accusations of institutional racism levied against the system in relation to crack cocaine run into several obstacles. The legislation specified a drug, not a type of offender. And considering both the lack of explicit discriminatory intent and the amplified societal fear associated with crack, and for those of you who weren't around during that time, it was the war on terror. It made the fear of H1N1, since I'm not allowed to call it the swine flu anymore, seem minimal. Given all of this, it's hard to believe that that was a discriminatory law on its face. If more African Americans and Latinos are using crack, then disparities here seem to be justified, and the overall stereotype of the crack user is rendered accurate. So in 1992, when 90% of all defendants convicted of crack-related crimes were black, and less than 5% of all crack-related convictions involved white defendants, this did not send up any warning signs. This did not ring any bells. However, when Dr. Dorothy Lockwood and her colleagues found that, according to the 1991 National Institutes of Drug Abuse Household Survey, when they found that whites comprised roughly 50% of all people who had tried or used crack frequently in the previous year, it sent shockwaves through the criminal justice community, and to a lesser degree, the academic community was the shockwaves. The criminal justice community was less enthusiastic. While blacks comprised 35% of crack cocaine users, this disparity is still overwhelming, even assuming a fair or even high amount of error in the NIDA, National Institutes of Drug Abuse Survey, these numbers show very, very clearly one thing: the system, from the lawmakers to the police, from prosecutors to judges, and even including juries, treated the crack cocaine problem as a minority matter. The full impact of the war on drugs cannot be understood independent of a second and equally important institutional development: the militarization of the American police. The most apparent manifestation of this is the expansion of police paramilitary units, or PPUs. First and foremost, this expansion has been a matter of numbers. According to research conducted by doctors Peter Kraska and Victor Kappeler, by the mid-1990s, 90% of all metropolitan areas of 50,000 residents or more had a PPU. And of that 10% that did not, roughly 1/4 of them were looking to establish a PPU in the coming years. Considering that roughly 12 years have passed since Kraska and Kappeler's research, and considering the fear that has been generated by the war on terror, I can only imagine that that number has increased in the years that have gone by. And it's not just that more departments have PPUs, it's how they're being used. In the 1960s and 1970s, when many urban departments first established such units, PPUs were mostly used to respond to civil riots, barricaded suspects, and hostage situations. As such, the PPUs of old were called out on average once, maybe less, per month. The mission of these units changed substantially in the 1980s and 1990s, when PPUs became the shock troops for the war on drugs. The frequency of call-outs more than quadrupled over a 15-year span, largely because PPUs were now being used primarily to conduct drug raids. It constituted over 75% of their work. The vast majority of these raids occurred in inner-city areas, and this has further solidified in America's public imagination the perception of these places and their residents as dangerous. The expansion of militarization is not limited to PPUs. Various aspects of military culture, ideology, training, tactics, and technology have slowly but noticeably crept into other areas of policing. In fact, the transformation has been so profound that a number of scholars now refer to the American police as the fifth branch of the American military. The most obvious manifestation of this is the extreme makeover of the police uniform. From the 1940s and into the 1980s, the common patrol officer dressed like a business professional. Polished shoes, pressed trousers, a collared shirt and a tie. Today, the patrol officer bears little resemblance to the professional of old, looking instead like a soldier, clad in a Kevlar vest, black fatigues, and combat boots. While it may seem a bit far-fetched, and several scholars have criticized this notion, I believe that appearance has a profound impact on how communities relate to the police. A professional appearance commands respect, cooperation, and ideally confidence, possibly even admiration. While the warrior pose adopted by today's police forces emphasizes fear and increases social distance between the police and the people who need their protection and service the most. This analysis would not be complete without examining the intervention, or lack thereof, of the United States Supreme Court. It is a Constitution Day lecture. These shifts in the focus and tactics of the police have not gone unnoticed by our nation's highest court. In fact, the war on drugs and the militarization of the American police have produced one of the most tumultuous legal eras in American history. While summarizing the court's standpoint is difficult, without going into excessive detail on specific cases, I will say this. At the very least, the court has been complicit in the development of these programs and practices, failing to intervene and limit the expansion of the tactics discussed earlier. At the very most, the court has turned its back on the spirit of the Constitution, the 4th and 14th Amendments specifically, opting to shroud itself in procedural law. Moreover, the court has shown little to no inclination to recognize, much less act against, institutional racism. In fact, it would seem that a number of justices cannot even seem to fathom why, Minority communities might not see the police in the same light as they do. There are two Supreme Court rulings that I would like to discuss in detail right now. The first, Wren v. the United States and the United States v. Drayton. I will start with Wren because it is indeed the simpler case. Wren's appeal to the Supreme Court sought to challenge the police practice of pretext stops, a tactic that was disseminated by the Drug Enforcement Administration as in its efforts to train state and local police to interdict drugs on the highways and on roadways. A pretext stop works something like this. An officer observes drivers, traffic, cars. That officer is looking for some indication of suspicion, something that tells him or her that something might just be a little bit off. Once the officer identifies a suspicious driver or car, the officer follows that car until they find a violation of the traffic code. Once the officer has identified a violation of the law, the traffic stop begins. But the traffic stop is not conducted to cite the individual, nor is it conducted to correct their erroneous behavior. It's conducted as the start of an investigation. This investigation begins as the officer approaches the vehicle. They peer inside the passenger compartment. They question the driver and any passengers looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They run the plates and the driver's license in search of any warrants or a criminal record. If the officer's suspicions are allayed, then the driver is frequently let off with a warning. If, however, the officer has increased suspicion, if he or she has reason to believe that there's more going on, the officer will frequently look to conduct a search, either by consent or otherwise. Wren claimed that such stops violated the Fourth Amendment insofar as most reasonable officers would not stop drivers for these reasons, absent the ulterior motives of drug enforcement. In a 9-0 decision, the court rejected Wren's argument, stating in no uncertain terms that the temporary detention of a motorist upon probable cause to believe that he has violated the traffic laws does not violate the Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable seizures, even if a reasonable officer would not have stopped the motorist absent some ulterior motive. Simply put, as long as officers can identify a violation of the traffic code, they are legally justified to stop the vehicle, regardless of the motivations that led them to be suspicious in the first place. While on the surface this seems like a reasonable conclusion, there are several problems. First, professionals are unanimous in their conclusion that everybody breaks some aspect of the bloated traffic law during almost every trip we make, even the police. Second, as such, the ruling essentially gives officers carte blanche to pull over whomever they want, provided they have a categorical knowledge of the traffic code. Second, this ruling embraces an instrumental use of the law. That is, it adopts almost an ends justify the means mentality, which, in my evaluation, inevitably decreases the legitimacy of the law and its agents in communities where such practices occur most. The traffic code does not exist to provide officers with probable cause to stop and search motorists for drugs. The traffic code exists to keep drivers and passengers safe on America's roadways. When the law is perverted in such a way, even to achieve the law becomes an instrument of oppression, as opposed to the idealization of democracy. When the law is frequently used capriciously against communities of color, is it really that surprising when these communities show demonstrably less confidence in the system? As I can pay attention to the time, I'm actually going to skip over the United States v. Drayton and move to the end. To reiterate the larger point of this lecture, which has probably gotten a little bit lost, if we want to make sense of those 6 minutes in Cambridge, if we want to understand why we have disparities, profound disparities throughout our systems of criminal justice and otherwise, we have to move beyond this search for the smoking gun. We have to move beyond these examinations of individual character and look critically at institutions, how they inform our thinking, how they shape our behavior, how they push us in directions that we as individuals may never, by our own free will, by our own motivation, go. These things are much more than context. Whether or not we are aware of it, they exercise a profound impact on us and thus are not simply relevant to the conversation. I believe they're at the core of it. In closing, I feel compelled to provide some sort of a where do we go from here? How do we move forward? I have 3 things I want to say. Number 1, it is vital that we reinvigorate the Constitution. I know that this is a Constitution Day lecture and I spoke very, very little about it. But at the core of all of this, at the core of this solution, is a realization not necessarily of what the framers intended the 14th Amendment to be, but rather what it could be and should be in a society, a democratic society, a diverse society like the one we find ourselves in today. Equal protection can no longer simply be construed as equality of opportunity within the law. To really embrace the 14th Amendment, to really grasp what it means, requires that we move it not just as from a peripheral consideration, but to the core of our thinking. Second, one thing has become clear to me in the last 10 years of my life, researching the police, reading classic studies and contemporary work. The current way we approach policing is simply not sustainable. The time has come for us as a society to reimagine what policing can and what policing should be. The lesson that I parrot over and over and over and over again in my Crim 340, the sociology of policing class, is this. If you want to understand the problems of policing, don't look at the people who do it. Don't look at funding. Don't look at training. Don't look at policy. Look at the institution and how it pushes the police in contradictory directions. Look at the institution and how it creates crisis after crisis. Look at the institution of policing and see the fractures that exist. We must, and the time is coming rapidly close when we will be given no choice but to reimagine what policing can be. And last but not least, we need to find a way to really repair the relationship between minority communities and not only the police, but any semblance or system of authority within this country. The alienation that has resulted from these inequalities in the criminal justice system, but from political and economic inequalities. The alienation is more profound than even I feel qualified to speak about. It's amazing. It's almost incomprehensible how powerless many of these communities feel. We may think that we're doing enough. That alienation is still there. That alienation is still ever present. But at some level, we're going to have to find a way to meaningfully come together in something that is more than simply a media circus or a public relations event. And I want to close with the words of Cornel West. I've never been the largest fan of Cornel West's work, not because it's of low quality or anything like that. It's brilliant. It's just his spirituality, I don't connect with it. But I heard Cornel West define justice, and it stuck with me in a very profound way. To Cornel West, Justice is what love looks like in public. I want you to look long and hard at our American system of criminal justice and ask yourself, is that what love looks like in public? I want to ask you to look back at those 6 minutes in Cambridge. Is that what love looks like in public? Somehow, some way, we have to find that. And we're running out of time. I want to thank everybody for their time and their patience, especially with the script in front of me. And I would gladly answer any questions that you may have. Please.
You've done any work looking at whether gated communities and private police forces have aided any of this or exacerbated the divisions and the problems?
I have done no firsthand research. I have read a couple of articles on this, but conceptually, the notion of privatizing the police, that is allowing certain communities, most notably communities of wealth, power, and influence, to provide their own police forces, to operate either independent or even under the color of the law without full legal responsibility, has been incredibly controversial. Most of the arguments out there have claimed that, of course, if they're not limited by the law, their primary responsibility will not be to the law, it will be to those who pay their paycheck. Of course, all that's out there right now, to the best of my knowledge, and I'll admit I have not been thoroughly researching this development, is anecdotal and theoretical. But in theory, it runs into the same problem that the police in the political era of policing, the mid to late 1800s and early 1900s ran into, when it was cronyism and political affiliation that got you your job. Anybody who's seen the movie Miller's Crossing knows exactly what I'm talking about. But for those who don't, during this era of the modern American police command, police officers, your job was tied to the political candidate who was in office at the time. When a mayor would get ousted, the new mayor would come in and install his cronies into positions of power. I think the fear is that when we have privatized police forces, that is exactly what's going to happen. The law becomes a secondary consideration or possibly simply an instrument through which these communities achieve their ends rather than actually serve the law. Thank you.
In considering institutions of racism or institutions that break down or prevent a sense of community, particularly what might be examples of institutions of solidarity that build up or sustain, promote a sense that the other person of another color or ethnicity is not radically different, but closer to me. So it seems to me that the institutions of racism and distinction, class, as well as race, are pretty thick on the ground. Are there institutions of solidarity or models thereof? Or do we all have to sort of have an intellectual, spiritual conversion and we leave institutions alone?
Well, I'm not sure about the intellectual and spiritual conversion. This goes back to the whole, was John Lennon right? Or about that all we really need is love and to, sorry, it's the whole rock and roll thing. I cannot get away from it. Was John Lennon right? If you're carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to make it with anyone anyhow. Is it really about the structure, the institution, or is it about us in our heart really learning to love the other, to willfully embrace the other? That's one that even rock lyrics aside, I don't know how to resolve that. I'm sure it's both. But in terms of institutions of solidarity, I will admit my analysis hasn't gone there, but what I do see are struggles within these institutions, within the institution of policing, within the institution of the courts, to take over and address, at the very least, some of the most egregious violations, and at the very most, to meaningfully overhaul the system. There are numerous police departments, chiefs, organizations that are out there attempting to transform the way things are doing. If you think that liberals are the biggest critics of the war on drugs, you probably haven't talked to enough police officers. While the police have generally shown a reticence to legalize it, they don't want the tools out of their arsenal, because these laws are the things the police use to obtain compliance and respect on a daily basis in the daily course of their action. Many admit right up front the war on drugs will not work. It's why I'm very comfortable when I say the war on drugs has failed and there's no end in sight. And yes, I want you to remember that when you leave, which is why I repeated it. This is not me as a sociologist who has read a lot of books. This is me as a social scientist who has heard this sentiment over and over and over from lawyers, from other officials in the criminal justice system, and most importantly, from the police. They believe that drugs do harm, but they don't believe in the war, at least not those who I've spoken with. So, in terms of how, that's the question I am thoroughly unprepared to answer. I wish I knew. I do think that love really does matter, and that spiritual conversion is going to be a vital part of it. But how we actually convert these institutions to a new way of operating where equality and justice means something radically different than they do today, that's a way homer. I'm going to have to consider that for a few days. Thank you. Yes?
You spoke of the mistrust of police in minority communities
Yes.
as a result of just policing in the U.S. and how it's been in the past. But is that the biggest influence, or are there other influences to take into consideration? For example, Latino immigrants usually have their own preconceived notion of police from
Oh, yes.
their countries before they even come here, and no matter how we act, we can't change that notion.
Well, I'm going to disagree with the last part. No matter how we act, we can't change that notion.
Well, at first.
Indeed, there is going to be that process through which we negotiate and ideally contradict the injustices of the past. In terms of, I think, the larger question, which was what are the other forces at work?
And how are they balanced?
How are they balanced? That's a darn. How are they balanced?
Is that really the biggest, is the injustices of the past? Or
Well,
is it also all these other factors?
Well, given that my perspective is inevitably clouded by the fact that my research, my thinking, my contact with other scholars has primarily focused in on racial profiling. So that biases me instantaneously to focus on the war on drugs. My reading of policing is very influenced by my understanding of the war on drugs. To me, the war on drugs, as it was developed in the 1980s and as it stands today, is the linchpin of institutional racism. It has been this key influence that has increased the tensions between minority communities and officers. The militarization of the police is directly linked to the war on drugs. The rulings of the Supreme Court with regards to the war on drugs have also amplified that. To me, I think the war on drugs is the most important part, at least from a criminal justice point of view. I would say that if we're going to start somewhere, and thank you, actually, this allows me to bridge back into Dr. Trelevin's point. If we're going to start somewhere, I think a good place to start would be to reimagine drug policy in this country, to revise it, to reform it, to step back and look at the harms it is causing and the benefits we're accruing from it. Because one of the central harms of it is it has created this distance, this animosity between the police who view inner cities not necessarily as places that can even be saved. Peter Moskos, a PhD candidate from Harvard University, did his dissertation in Baltimore, Maryland, in the Eastern District, one of the most crime-ridden places in America. Anybody who's watched The Wire knows what I'm talking about. Now, there's 3 people in here who've watched The Wire. Shame on you people. Come on. This is a great television show because it's not a television show, so watch it. I'm not even kidding. The Eastern District is one of the most crime-ridden areas in America. He goes down to Baltimore. He gets permission to join the force and do a year on the force and conduct a study. During his earliest weeks on the streets in Baltimore, one of his fellow officers says, "We should just nuke this place. It's not worth saving." Now, admittedly, that's one of the far polar ends. But at the same time, that tells us something about this relationship on both sides. So I believe the war on drugs is at the core. I believe that a number of other things definitely play in. I think that the memory, the collective memory of slavery and the slave patrols is vital. I think that the police actions during the civil rights movement, if you've never seen Taylor Branch or read Parting the Waters, you need to do this. I need to do this. I've never read it. I've just watched him on a Spike Lee movie. It's profound. 4 Little Girls, it's available at the library. Has anybody seen that? It's undoubtedly his best work. Of documentary at the very least. I like Do the Right Thing as well. But these elements of history, they live through the stories of parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and uncles and aunts who were there, who were victims, who were dancing in the streets. Bull Connor may not be alive today, but the memory of Bull Connor most definitely is. So history is a much more troublesome entity than we usually give it credit for. And by we, I mean mostly sociologists. I bet historians give it the proper due. Yeah. Mike. I wish I had a clean and tidy answer to that question. I've been working on a clean and tidy answer to that question for about 2 years, and I'm not satisfied with my answer. For those who don't know, Mike brings up community-oriented policing. Alongside the war on drugs, there's been another sweeping development in American policing. It's called community-oriented policing. The idea was that police and the community need to form partnerships and share authority as to how policing occurs within certain areas. That the community must be involved, engaged. They are a valuable source of not only information on crime, but direction on how crime should be addressed. The community should influence how the police do their job. This has occurred at the same time as this ramped up war on drugs. It has occurred at the same time of this rampant militarization. There seems to be a contradiction in here. What Peter Kraska refers to the militarization of the police alongside the development of community-oriented policing as the iron fist in the velvet glove. And fascinating article he wrote with Derek Paulson. If you ever want a copy of it, I'll be gladly provided. But his argument is this, is that these two contradictory forces, at some level, are dooming the police to failure. Now, we try to resolve this contradiction, but it's simply irresolvable, in my opinion. Where we go from here, if I had a best guess, is we're going to create a new set of agencies that will serve the specific needs that are currently conglomerated within the police. My only hope is that any new organization, which has to happen with a redefinition of what policing can be, that any new organization doesn't overemphasize the role of militaristic force. Because to me, the increase in militarization of the American police has not brought about any sort of increase in control. In fact, it's only been an escalation. There's some little flaw in that masculine logic that if I have the bigger gun, the other guy will give up. It's consistently been shown, not only throughout history, but most definitely throughout modern American history of policing, that when the police get a bigger gun or a new toy, criminal enterprise figures out a way to either deal with it or get a bigger gun. We have to get away from that masculinist logic that somehow we just need enough force or more force than the other guy. One last?